Did you know that financial planning is a bona fide professional pursuit and that it's significantly different from mere product sales? This week, we're going to be talking about why financial planning is important, whether or not you're doing it, whether or not you're doing it properly, and whether or not you're just working with someone who's trying to sell you something.
Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast that explores how financial advisors' blind spots can harm your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. In this podcast, we'll provide advice on how you can achieve better outcomes by maximizing investments and minimizing taxes. Let's put our thinking caps on as we consciously decide to get smarter about our money.
This week, we're speaking with Carrie List. Carrie is the former president and CEO of FP Canada, which is the body that provides the Certified Financial Planner, which is the CFP designation. Carrie, welcome.
Thanks, John. Nice to be here.
In my humble opinion, you have done more to promote the notion of financial planning being a bona fide profession in Canada than anyone else. Could you maybe take 4 or 5 minutes to maybe walk us through the things that happened during your tenure as the president and CEO that helped establish and professionalize the pursuit of financial planning as a bona fide professional pursuit?
Sure, John, and thanks for the kind words. I'm not sure. I think there's lots of people that have contributed a lot, but I appreciate those words. I think maybe I'll just start with my background as to why I think I had some success over the 20 plus year career at FP Canada, 15 years as CEO. And that's very much because I believed so much, not just in the importance of financial planning and what it can do for not only individually, for all of us as individuals, but for society, frankly, and for the burden on society, to alleviate some of the burden on society. I believed so strongly in the importance of financial planning since really quite a young age that for me, it wasn't a job and it wasn't a career as much as it was a calling and a pursuit. And I think that contributed a lot. I'll say that before I joined FP Canada, I actually worked in areas within financial planning to accomplish the same thing. Just before joining FP Canada, I spent a few years at George Brown College setting up the baccalaureate financial planning program there. And again, it's the same notion. It's trying to elevate it as a profession and its importance, noting that really it is a bachelor's degree minimum pursuit, and that didn't exist in Canada. When I was approached to join FP Canada back in 2002, I guess it was, I'd already been a volunteer for them, and it was the easiest decision of my life. I think it took me about 3 minutes to make the decision to join them. And part of the reason there was I believed that, of course, it was called FPSC at the time, Financial Planning Standards Council changed to FP Canada. But I believed that Canada needed a singular body that was there not just for financial planners, but for society. There was an organization there that recognized the importance of financial planning on society and that it would actually drive financial planning to that professional level. And I saw FP Canada as being the best opportunity for that. At the time, frankly, it was a pretty small organization. It had some very rocky beginnings. I think when I joined, there were 17 staff, and maybe even less than that. I think when I became CEO in 2006, we had around 25 staff. When I retired, we were up to close to 70. In 2002, there was a lot of question as to, what really financial planning was, frankly. There was some debate as to whether financial planning really meant mutual fund advice. And the MFDA probably at the time argued that they were as competent to regulate financial planning as anybody else because they saw it as, frankly, mutual fund sales. And so I think one of the first things that I really pushed at FP Canada was to elevate the recognition of the importance of distinguishing between financial planning and investment advice and mutual fund advice and sales. And that was no easy task, I will say. I think that the industry was very reticent to come along. And one of our first tasks was to really demonstrate that difference and that importance by creating a competency profile for what a financial planner was and really show that you could assess competence against what that profile was and show that profile of what made a competent financial planner was actually critically important to Canadians. So that was one of the first tasks, in addition to putting standards of practice in place, which didn't exist in the industry. Those were the two first tasks that I undertook when I joined the organization.
Sure.
But yeah,
I was going to say, I've got a copy here of definitions, standards, competencies right here. I brought it as
exactly.
collateral material to show the people that are watching at home that
There you
this is
go.
codified, it's in writing, and it's the sort of thing that people can refer to all the time. Before you continue on your story,
Yeah.
I wanted to interject very quickly to see if you can give me a sense, now that it's 2024, of the lay of the land presently. And I guess what I'm asking is, this is now the distinction that you just made a moment ago between financial planning and product sales. And a lot of people thought of them as being one and the same back in the day. And I'm wondering what your view is in terms of the progress that has or has not been made in the ensuing years and the lay of the land in 2024 from the perspective of the general public, but also from the perspective of regulators and the industry in general.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I thought you might get to the point of asking me what what I feel best about where the industry is and what I am not happy about, and I think that question tackles both sides because I have to say that I'm extremely heartened and really I don't want to say pleasantly surprised. I thought we'd get there, but I think in the last 5, 6 years, we've probably got there faster than I expected in terms of not just the industry, but frankly, the industry and the public's recognition that financial planning isn't just about which mutual funds to buy. And that was very slow. It was a slow burn getting there. But as I look at even advertising, firms always talked about your financial plan years ago, but they didn't really know what they were talking about, or they didn't really care. That's changed. When you look at, I won't name the big guys, but whether it's the banks or the large wealth management firms, when they talk about financial planning, they're really talking about financial planning now. And I think that's new. And that took a long time to get there. I think that's fantastic. And I think we've come a long way. On the flip side, you ask, oh, and then consumers, look, that's a tough nut to crack. And I've always said that one of the reasons financial planning needs to be professionalized is because consumers don't understand that it's a profession. And we always got the pushback saying if consumers don't see the difference or don't see the need, then it shouldn't be a profession. And my argument is no, if society needs it and consumers don't see the need, that's when you really need it professionalized so that consumers will recognize that because governments and regulators recognize it. Consumers aren't there yet, I don't think, but I think they're getting there. I think that just anecdotally, I used to get people knew I was a CFP, people knew I was CEO of FP Canada. I'd get neighbors or colleagues, not colleagues, but acquaintances say, I know your job. What should I invest in? And it was always very frustrating. Anecdotally, I see more now. Maybe it's my age and my circle of friends that are getting older and recognizing that financial planning isn't about what should I invest in, but it's about how much money do I need? Will I have enough? And how do I manage it? And I'm getting a lot more of that. And I think I'm seeing a lot more of that. So even on the public recognition is always going to be slower, John, always. But I think it's getting there. In terms of regulators and governments, pretty frustrating. And I think that part of that is governments have their own agendas and governments are focused on votes for the next election. And so that always gets in the way because it's always the short-sightedness. You look at climate change or whatever other important cause. The reason we're so slow on getting to where we need to be is because governments and politicians don't have the ability to take the long game, and that's what they all need to do. Regulators, we spent a lot of time trying to get government and regulators to basically separate financial planning from investment advice and product sales. And while they've done that to an extent with the Financial Title Protection Act in Ontario and some of the changes there, I think it's been botched to a large extent. And I think it's being botched because the regulators and the regulatory system in this country is still based on product sales, investment products or insurance products. And that's the type of people that are running those organizations. And that's what they understand. And they don't necessarily get that financial planning is a cohesive whole service in its own right that really should be distinct from that. So I think that we're still in a messy situation there. And I should mention, John, I think it's really important. I would say one of my biggest frustrations for many years, and it's come to fruition, is that somehow governments in particular and regulators seem to treat the provision of financial services and financial planning differently than every other profession, in that they believe somehow, maybe they bought into financial planning, but they somehow believe that competition amongst different certifications, credentials is a good thing. And they look to encourage competition. Everything that you read about what makes a profession is quite the opposite, is that you actually need homogeneity amongst all of your providers of professional service. Otherwise, the public doesn't know what they're going to get. And you don't have different types of doctor, or you have specializations, but you don't have 4 different competing medical doctor credentials. You don't have 4 different competing lawyer credentials. And in fact, the accounting profession is a great example. The Quebec government started it, and the rest of the country moved along, is they forced the accounting profession to unify around one single regulator and one single designation, because it wasn't in the interest of the consumer to have competition. Somehow, regulators and governments have missed this completely when it comes to the provision of financial services. And it's an incredible frustration of mine. As I retired as CEO of FP Canada in 2021, that I would say remained my biggest frustration, and has actually continued to get even worse over the last 3 years.
I would say that one of the observations that I have is that comprehensive financial planning means you've got a variety of tools in the toolbox, and you recommend whatever tool is most appropriate for the circumstance, and perhaps even offer a variety of tools so that the client can have some input as to what works best for them. A lot of what has happened in the 90s and at the turn of the millennium was just selling an investment product. And for instance, if a person is young and has a mortgage and a spouse and maybe a dependent child or two, probably the first thing that person needs to do is to buy insurance. And if you're, as they say in the business, if you're good with the hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if your value proposition is one of merely investing, then you're not doing a really good job of comprehensive planning if you don't say to the person, look, we can get to the investing in due course, but first things first, we have to look after your insurance needs, because that's more pressing and it's more impactful in terms of if something goes off the rails. And that is, as a simple example of how the industry needs to think. And we may be moving in that direction, but I'm with you. I'm frustrated that it's taking as long as it is, and that we're still as far away from that kind of an end goal than we otherwise might have been.
I think we're further actually away. And John, I think you've raised a good point. And I think it's in your explanation, it's the reason that we have the problem, is that financial planners, for the most part, aren't self-employed, independent professionals, or they're actually not employed by an employer who is asking them to provide a professional service on a fee basis. And most financial planners, their prime source of income or their prime business is the placement of investment products or the placement of insurance products. And that can't help but get in the way of your ability to actually provide comprehensive financial planning services. There's no reason that a planner shouldn't be able to also provide investment products and insurance products by any stretch of the imagination. But when your income is solely dependent on that, you are naturally conflicted, and it's naturally going to get in the way of your ability to provide true financial planning, just as you've described. If I'm a licensed securities dealer and I don't even have an insurance license, why are you going to lead with insurance?
Exactly.
Un-
There's an old saying.
unless you're providing on a fee for service basis your professional advice. It's not going to happen.
There's a quote from Upton Sinclair that comes to mind that I think you're familiar with, and that is, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Ex-
And that we have an entire industry of product sales that maybe quote unquote doesn't get it with regard to financial planning because it's seen as an impediment to what's actually the main source of income, the revenue generation, when in fact it is something that can be done and should be done in furtherance of more purposeful, more intelligent, thoughtful product placement, because using the right products in the right amount in the right way, and you're doing them in the right order and in a way that's tax efficient and in a way that reflects your objectives and whatnot, as opposed to, well, what can I get client X to buy? And whatever I can get him to buy is what I'm going to sell because I want to make money.
Yes, I think we've made progress there in that I don't think it's as much the conflict of sales versus advice as it used to be.
Mhm.
But I think that your initial point is the most important one, which is it is a conflict between the type of advice you're going to give and the type of advice that is really needed. In other words, and like to your point about should you be leading with insurance, you may be still completely unconflicted, do all of the right things when it comes to the investment advice. But that's not helping when your client has 3 kids, a partner who doesn't work, a mortgage of $1 million, and has no life insurance. That's a very simplistic
Yeah,
example.
exactly.
But when we can look at much more complex examples where there are very complex needs, and the focus just straight goes to it's not just what they're selling, it's what they're comfortable with and what they know ultimately their income is going to be based on.
As the saying goes, if you're good with the hammer, everything looks like a nail. So
Exactly.
if you're good at recommending investment products, then that becomes the quote unquote solution for every problem
Exactly.
that you encounter.
Exactly.
If you could take a moment to provide some context, I think you will know the numbers. I've got a pretty good sense of what they are, but how many CFPs are there in Canada? How many are there worldwide? How are we doing in Canada in terms of CFPs per capita? And what I'm trying to get a handle on is what you touched on 5 or 10 minutes ago, which is the idea of, in order to have true professional status, you need homogeneity. And the CFP designation is the one designation that the international community is coalescing around with regard to the CFP mark. So how does Canada stack up compared to other nations?
Yeah, I've been away from the front desk for a few years, John, but I believe there are around 17,500 CFPs in Canada today. That number's been fairly steady, growing very at a slow pace because there were a lot of 50 plus CFPs in the early days that are now have moved into retirement. So it's hard to replenish those numbers. But I think in the 17,500, you're seeing much more. auth- I don't want to say this in a disparaging way, but I say authentic planners out of the 17,500 than there were 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, there were a lot of people that were granted equivalency that were really had been insurance salespeople. And I think today you're getting much more comprehensive planners out of that 17,500. Worldwide, John, I can't tell you the number. I think it's in the 200,000 range. I know the US is well over 100,000 now. So I think we're in around 200,000 plus in worldwide at this point. It's grown very rapidly because of a lot of the developing countries, and the U.S. has grown at an extremely rapid pace over the last 15 years. That's due in no small part because their numbers were so low, frankly, relative per capita relative to Canada. When I came in the mid 2000s, I think we had around 1,000 CFPs, and the US had around 65,000 CFPs. So you do the math. Canada was dramatically higher per capita. I think worldwide, Canada is still, maybe with a couple of exceptions in a couple of the smaller territories, Canada is still far and away the largest number of CFPs per capita or per potential client or per se. in the world. So that's a great sign. And I think we're close to the numbers that are probably needed to serve consumers if we get that 17,500, let's say 20,000 as a cap, that are really all truly doing financial planning. I think that's a good number, and I think that's a number to strive for.
It's funny because, to put it into context, Canada is maybe 1/9 of the U.S. population. The U.S. is 9 times as large as Canada, but Canada has 1/6 the number of financial planners. We actually have more CFPs per capita than the U.S. And that, I think, is encouraging because typically it's the U.S. that leads on these things where, as you're trying to develop international standards, most people look to the.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject. I think we also have to remind ourselves when we're looking at these numbers, the numbers are skewed down for Canada because you have to add Quebec financial planners who don't have the CFP. So because there's a reciprocity there, and Quebec, it's basically the same thing, but it's a different title. So if you add the 5,000 planners in Quebec, you're really up to around 22,000 in Canada, which puts it probably about double per capita of the US and probably 3 times or 4 times per capita that of most countries. So the numbers are actually even much stronger than they appear on paper because you have to add Quebec to that.
This is something that I spoke about a lot. I was at the turn of the millennium. I wrote a book called The Professional Financial Advisor, and I updated it every time every time there was a regulatory reform, thinking that the path to professionalism was one that was paved with regulatory enforcement. And so every time first I just wrote the book, and then in Ontario here we had the so-called fair dealing model. So I put out a second edition, and then we had the CRM1, the client relationship model. So I put out a third edition for that, and then a fourth edition for CRM2. And now those were all things that are regulating the securities industry and the investment industry, but there were knockoff effects with regard to the regulation of financial planning it was a backdrop. And if you're trying to professionalize the wealth management industry, I thought of them as being very, very much in lockstep. If you could take a moment to walk us through the semi-fiduciary responsibility that CFPs have in Canada. It's not exactly a full fiduciary responsibility, but it's close. How would you explain that, the responsibility of doing what's best for your client?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of confusion around fiduciary. I banged my head against a brick wall on this and never was able to really succeed on the understanding of this. Whether an individual is a fiduciary vis-a-vis their client or patient or whatever else is determined by law. It's not determined by a piece of paper. So no the CFP does not say you are a fiduciary because it's a moot point. You either are or you aren't, as determined by the nature of the relationship you have, and that would be determined by the courts. The reason I say that, John, is because, frankly, the duty of care and loyalty that a financial planner has to their client is fully equivalent to the duty of care and loyalty that a fiduciary, as determined in law, has to their client. So I would say, no, it's not necessarily a fiduciary relationship in law, but that you heard it here first. I'm retired. I can say this. As far as I'm concerned, a CFP has a fiduciary obligation to their clients. Now, in financial planning, there's an expectation that the client participates in decision-making. And that, by definition, may actually eliminate a court's determination that a CFP was in fact a fiduciary, because a fiduciary is acting in a trustee relationship, and where a medical doctor doesn't expect the patient to do their homework, although they should, and participate fully in the decision-making because the doctor has a lot more knowledge. I think there's a higher level of expectation on the client in financial planning, but the nature of the obligation that the planner has to their client, to me, is fully equivalent to the nature of the obligation that any fiduciary would have to their client or patient in another profession that is deemed to be a fiduciary relationship.
And I find that reassuring, and hopefully the people listening today will find that reassuring as well. Let's see if we can end on the question I always end on, which is the podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. If it was up to Carrie List, what advice would you give to people listening today to encourage them to make better wealth decisions?
Yeah, I'd have to parse that into sort of age groups because for the younger people today, I hear all the time, oh, the future of the world is grim. So why should I care? I'm just going to spend everything I've got. There's been lots of generations where the people have deemed the future of the world to be grim. We've actually had world situations that are a lot worse than they are today. And I would say to young people today, I know it's tough, but just the basics of financial planning, if you start taking that seriously, taking the importance of money seriously, and look at your parents, look at your grandparents, you're going to get there. Just start doing some of the things that may help. Very hard to look out in that future. We never think we're going to get old, but may help 20, 30, 40 years on. Credit card debt. The amount of young people that I see in expensive restaurants, I don't even go out as much anymore because of the exorbitant costs. Think about, do you really need to live the lifestyle that you are, knowing it's at the expense of, are you ever going to be able to buy a home, et cetera, et cetera. So that's on the youth side. As we get into the middle age and over, John, I would say that one of the best things I ever did was not so much put together a budget, but I actually got a budgeting software program and started tracking where I'm spending my money. And it was really eye-opening. It completely changed my life when I did that I actually know where all my money goes. And that's a very freeing bit of knowledge and awareness. So, I mean, those are very simple answers, John, but to the average Canadian, I think those are two recommendations I would have.
Gary, I want to thank you. Your insights are always appreciated, and your contribution has been immense. And so it's been my pleasure to speak with you today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been fun. It's been fun to talk about this again.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. The views expressed in this program are not to be construed as specific advice. It is recommended that you consult a qualified advisor before taking action. His books, The Professional Financial Advisor 4, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry, and Bullshift are available through Amazon and in bookstores throughout Canada. You can reach John at 647-STAND-UP. That's 647-782-6387 or at jdegooey@designedsecurities.ca.